Roger, Eddy, thanks for joining us. And before we start, let me say you're a board member of the Illinois Channel, so thank you again for joining us. You're here. Tell us at this educational conference in Springfield, first of all, who's the audience and what's the purpose of this conference?
Well, the purpose is to allow for teams of school districts that include school board members, superintendents, business officials, and principals to come together and to become educated about the issues that are important right now on the legislative docket as the session goes on, and really kind of talk about common concerns and ways that we can help advocate for public policy that supports public education.
Does everything come down to money, or are there other issues that are equally important or secondarily important?
Well, resources are important, obviously, but it's not everything. As you know, there are other issues related to Assn and the state's role in...
Say what Assn is.
The Every Student Succeeds Act and developing a new accountability model for the state of Illinois. That's important. We also have a lot of other pieces of legislation related to mandates and expectations for school districts that have something to do with resources, but it also has to do with local control. There are bills related to other issues. Funding is very important. Property tax and the potential property tax freeze is an important issue to school districts. Really concerns us right now because it is the most stable and reliable source of funding for schools, and there are some attempts right now to freeze property taxes in various ways that concern our schools locally. Pension cost shift is another issue that our schools are concerned about, and those transiently have something to do with resources and money, but it's not necessarily the budget. It's those other issues that can hurt us.
Let's go to on the pension cost shift. A lot of times this stuff flies, I think, over the head of people that maybe not be familiar with what we're talking about. What is it, and how would that impact the local homeowner and their property taxes?
Well, it's the potential of having the state's share of the pension costs transferred to local school districts, and
which is collectively billions of dollars.
Well, the legacy costs, the costs to this point would remain with the state, but forward it would be the liability for employees, certified employees of school districts, and they would have to levy for that. In some way, they'd have to pay for it. So the potential is that much like IMRF, the Municipal Retirement Fund, which has a specific levy, this may not have a specific levy for it, but the funds will have to be generated somewhere locally to pay that money to the teacher's retirement system. So in many communities, that will come in the form of a tax increase at a time when the other attempt is to freeze property taxes. So if you freeze property taxes at a time you're putting an additional strain on school districts to pick up pension cost shift, it's kind of a nasty double whammy.
I was going to say, you're setting up an economic train wreck right there.
Yeah, math doesn't work this way. So it really doesn't. I mean, local districts then have nowhere else to turn, and if they can't turn because of property tax freezes, then programs suffer and children receive less education resources than they did the year before.
One of the problems is we have talked over the years, and you, to remind the audience, we're a legislator for years. The governor has cut out K-12. In other words, he's funded K-12 through the whole fiscal year where other things aren't. Is there a chance that we could get the lawmakers to say, because of the timetable of K-12 education, let's pass their budget by, let's say, April 1, so that they can make their hiring decisions for the opening of school in August? I know the school administrators would love that. What about from the legislator's standpoint? Is there any reason why that couldn't be done?
Well, I don't think from individual legislator standpoint, but when you're talking about grand bargains in Springfield, and you're talking about all of the other issues that are part of the discussions, to let one that is so dear and near to everyone involved kind of be settled before being used as a pressure point probably is against the natural political grain that kind of causes deals to happen. Now, would we love it? You bet we would. And does it make sense? You bet it does. School districts have to make enormous decisions related to personnel, for example, long before the end of June, which last year was the time we knew the budget. So it makes a lot of sense. It certainly is good public policy to have that happen. I would love to see everyone move in that direction, but the politics and the pressures involved with these grand bargains kind of eliminate that from being a real possibility. I think we're going to advocate for that, and we'll strongly advocate for that kind of a common sense solution.
Last question is, we now have a Trump administration and we have Secretary of Education who is very pro-choice as far as pushing that. What are your thoughts relative to what you're hearing out of D.C.?
Well, I mean, obviously, she's made it known that she's very much in support of what she calls quality choices for children. I think our job is to convince her and others that those quality choices can and do exist in public schools, and that public schools educate almost 90% of the children in this country. And these arguments aren't separate. We can have quality in public schools. What we have to have is some flexibility and the resources that would allow for that quality to exist within the public schools, because that's where you're going to affect the education of 90% of the future American citizens. So that's what we have to convince her. We have to let her know that while we might have some problems, that schools can be creative and they can solve those problems within the public structure if they have the flexibility, the mandate relief that's necessary to do that, and of course the resources to provide kids with that quality education. So that's our role, that's our responsibility. We need to convince the now Secretary of Education that that's the right path.
Yeah, I was going to say, and we'll end with this. I mean, we heard a lot about cutting regulations on business to free the economy. When you get federal dollars, there's a lot of strings attached and mandates on that as well that then allow the local, kind of tie the hands of the local school administrators, right?
Well, it's not just the federal dollars and what the intended federal dollars are for. It's the idea that there are all kinds of executive orders and dear colleague letters that come out of the Department of Education that kind of become public policy for education, create costs, create mandates, less flexibility for local schools that want to do the right thing, that aren't even statutory. They just come in the form of these dear colleague letters. And, if the Department of Education would simply pivot away from that kind of oversight, which is one of the encouraging things we're hearing. I mean, we're hearing a lot of concerns, but we're hearing some encouraging things. So we have to hang on to that. But our responsibility is to convince the new Secretary of Education that public schools are the best place to deliver education, given that additional flexibility and those resources we need to do it.
Roger, Eddy, thanks for joining us.
Always, anytime. Thank you.